Hey everybody, it's Lavender Town, and today I want to talk about same face syndrome. Now, I think everyone in the artist community is at least a little bit aware of what this is, but just in case, I'll go over the concept. Same face syndrome is when an artist draws multiple different characters with the same face, as you might assume. And there's a couple different reasons why people tend to call this out and encourage people not to do this. Mainly that it's boring or it seems uncreative. Also because it can be a little weird. If a young girl character has the same or similar face to a much older guy or an old woman or a cat, it's a little bit strange. And this is a common pitfall that not just young artists fall into. I'll get more into that later. But basically, I just wanted to make this video to sort of talk about this whole concept of same face syndrome and about the more complicated reasons why you should or shouldn't worry about it. And of course, I'm going to show you a way to test to see if your characters have too similar of faces, ways to get around it, and to talk about the reasons why same face syndrome is a prevailing issue for a lot of different artists. So typically, same face syndrome is seen as a sort of newbie mistake, something that young artists do because they don't know how to draw other types of faces. And at first I can understand why a lot of people believe that that's where a majority of same face syndrome comes from. Obviously, when you're still learning, it's hard to draw lots of different types of mouths, noses, and eyes, and it's difficult to draw, say, older characters or characters who just aren't, whatever you're most interested in. You don't have as big of a visual memory for these types of characters, and it can be difficult. So sometimes you'll have the same faces showing up when maybe they shouldn't. But in defense of young artists, I also want to say that's not the only place that we're seeing a ton of same face syndrome. For example, in a lot of our most popular media, same face syndrome is rampant. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, I'd like you to just think back to some of the more popular films that you've seen that are animated or more popular shows. I would hazard to guess that at least one of the shows that you're really into right now has a bit of a case of same face syndrome. One company in particular that is really notorious for this is Disney, and it's really interesting to compare Pixar, who Disney acquired, and Disney standard, because the way that they do their character modeling, at least from before the acquisition, is very different. So these are three female characters from Disney, obviously. Two of them you can kind of excuse because they're supposed to be related, but Rapunzel isn't related to them, and yet she has remarkably similar facial modeling. They have very similar noses, eyes, and overall facial proportions, which makes them look really, really similar. And you might wonder, why would a high-profile company who could hire any artist they want and any modeler they want have their characters look so similar? Obviously, this isn't a newbie mistake. One of the reasons is that Disney gets a lot of its money from merchandise, and it's a lot easier to make a doll with a different paint job than a doll with a different paint job and a different mold for their face. So a lot of the Disney dolls have the same mold of a generic female face, and they just paint them over differently and give them different hair. I'm guessing it also has a lot to do with brand recognition, because you notice Disney only seems to have a problem with same face syndrome when they're creating a Disney princess movie or adding a girl to the Disney princess line. As soon as it seems like they're making a movie about something that doesn't have to do with the Disney princess line, we see a lot more interesting faces, particularly out of their female characters. Atlantis, Hercules, and Lilo and Stitch all come to mind. Another extremely popular example is Adventure Time. These characters have largely the same face. Marceline has two little fangs sticking out, but when they're at a resting neutral position, it's impossible to tell the difference between their faces. And I think that's pretty clearly because the style is so simple that there's very little room to customize their facial expressions. Now, although I've given you some examples of big professional projects and companies who do same face syndrome and it doesn't seem to hinder their work at all, I know a lot of you might still want to avoid it in your own work. So if that is what you're thinking, I will give you a little test so you can see if your characters are suffering from same face syndrome. I'm going to do this with my own comic characters and really see if they are different enough. So basically what you do is you draw your characters their faces next to each other, and you just draw their heads and their necks, and you draw their faces without any ornamentation on them and no hair. So basically I'm going to draw my three of my main characters from my comic Unfamiliar without their hair or anything else, and just try to show how they're different side by side, and try to decide for myself if that is different enough. A lot of people rely on color and hair to make their characters look different, so this is a great way to make sure that you're not doing that if that's something you want to avoid. If you're wondering why this is even important, I would just say that if you're able to do this and your characters look distinct and you can recognize them easily, it allows you to change their outfits and hair as you need without worrying about clarity. Clarity is a big issue, especially in comics, film, animation, anything like that. You don't want your audience wondering what's going on or wondering who's who. And if you have clear faces, it will allow you to do whatever you want with their hair, their outfits. You can show them with a bathrobe and a towel over their hair, and people will still know who they are. And this should be harder depending on whether your style is simple or realistic. The simpler your style is, the closer you're getting to an Adventure Time kind of standstill where your style is so simple that it's hard to make severe edits to change a character's face. The more detail you have in the face, the more you're able to make changes. So, for example, if you have a nose, that allows you to make the nose different, and that's what I tend to do first when I'm designing different characters. So for example, Babs has a heart-shaped nose, Planchette has a small triangle nose, and Pinion has a longer triangle nose. I like making the noses unique because whatever facial expression they're having, usually their nose isn't wildly affected. So if you have a character who usually has sleepy eyes and that's their sort of point of difference from the other characters, but then they're surprised so their eyes are wide open, sometimes you lose that unique characteristic, at least for that panel, and it can be confusing. Skin details like freckles and scars also help because those are also things that stay consistent on your character no matter what facial expression they are having. Now, here's a question I have for you guys. Why don't we hear about same body syndrome? Because I think this is a bigger problem than a lot of people let on, and it's weird that no one gets called out for this because it's way more rampant than same face syndrome as far as I'm concerned, and it's even more important that you don't suffer from this if you're trying to make a clear character design. When your character has same face syndrome, it's still perfectly possible that you'll know who they are just by their hair or whatever, that kind of thing. But there's a lot of scenarios in which your character might be being seen from far away or being seen in a shadowy silhouette where it is vital that their body is different from the other characters' bodies. I would say this is something you should focus on even more. And this is what I try to do mostly with my comics, so I'm obviously a little biased, but I try to make sure that every character has a really unique sort of structure to themselves. So for example, Babs is sort of an hourglass shape, Pinion is sort of long, lanky, and thin, and then Planchette is a pear shape where she's got most of her weight in her hips. I know, this video is supposed to be all about faces, but I couldn't help but mention that that's an even more key part of making your characters look different most of the time, so I thought it was important to talk about. So this is actually the best exercise I can think of to make sure that your characters are different, and this is kind of what you'd want to do before you design your characters, but you could reverse engineer them this way too. Basically what I'm doing is I'm challenging myself to make completely separate faces from a set of the same eyes. Eyes are often how we differentiate our characters, so I thought I would just take that away from myself and not allow myself to make their faces different via their eyes. So I have 4 sets of eyes, I mean. And I basically just copied them all the way down, and now I'm just trying to make little changes to each of them so that they look totally different and they have a life of their own. I'm changing their face shape, their noses and their mouths and eyebrows, and that's all I'm really able to do. I'm not letting myself do hair or anything else. So obviously, the more dainty you want your character to look, the smaller you want their jaw to look in general. I'm trying to do lots of different noses, long, short, sort of button noses, ski jump noses, straight noses, all of that. And you can see that these characters are already looking really different, even though they're sharing the same eyes a lot of the time. Like I said, scars are great. Don't be afraid to do weird stuff with the eyebrows, because that's another point where humans have a lot of variation. There's some people who legitimately have no eyebrows, and then others who have so much eyebrow they can barely handle it. So in the end, this is what they turned out like, and honestly, I really like a lot of these faces, and I don't think I would have come up with them if I wasn't challenging myself to make them really different from each other. So that's another recommendation I would have, is if you're trying to design characters that look different from each other, design them all on the same page or the same file together so that you can see whether they're looking really similar or really different. Do they look good as an ensemble? Do they look related when they're not? These are all questions you can ask yourself just to make sure you avoid it if same face syndrome is something that you're worried about. Thanks for watching all the way to the end, and I'll see you next week. Thank you to all of my patrons, including Catherine VG, Gaia Muscayo, Scott Peterson, Weeb, Ellie Quiznak, Miss Misu, BB Dave, Kato Cat, Christy Stewart, Paynamo, Elizabeth Albin, Calpompone, Loaf, DeSweet12, Aaron Sawicki, Super Pixel, Taka, Isabella Spooky, Lovely, Lachlan MD, Mystic, Enzo Jobert, Your Boy ST, JJ Jade, Lawyer Buter, Pastel G-Man, and Addie Visual. Thank you guys so much for your support.